Hello and welcome to the CASTcast. This is the podcast for the Association for Software Testing, and more specifically, the Conference for the Association for Software Testing, otherwise known as CAST. I'm Michael Larson.
And I'm Claire Moss.
And today we are happy to be joined by Paul Holland. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Michael. Hello, Claire.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So Paul has been around CAST for quite some time. I don't quite know exactly how long, but we always like to start these shows to let our guests kind of fill in their backstory, and let's let you fill in the details.
Paul, where do you even come from?
Where do I even come from? I was born in England. I moved to Canada when I was 2, so I definitely consider myself Canadian. Now I'm surrounded by foreigners because I live and work in the United States of America, just outside New York City. I've been here for about 3.5 years. I live in a city called White Plains, and I commute into Manhattan on a daily basis. I've been involved with the Association for Software Testing since its inception, and I've been to every CAST except for the last 2. Obviously, I'm going again to Nashville. I've been the head facilitator at all but CAST 1, where Scott Barber was the head facilitator. I took over from him, I believe it was in CAST 2. And then CAST in New York City 3 years ago, I was the program chair. So I gave up the head facilitation seat to Rich Robinson, who has facilitated the last 2. And now I'm very happy to be back as the head facilitator for CAST in Nashville.
So how did you get involved with software testing?
I have a computer science degree in 1987. Yes, I'm that old. I graduated with my degree in computer science. And what the courses, the 4 years at Carleton University taught me was that I do not want to be a designer. I don't want to be a coder for my career. So I started out, my first job was an applications engineer at Xerox. I was working on their high-end laser printers that print up to 135 pages a minute. And I was doing pre-sale and post-sale support, troubleshooting, helping with sales, and also helping with use of the printers afterwards. And I did that for about 3.5 years. The next thing I did was a complete job shift. I became a helicopter pilot for the Canadian military, and I did that for 5 years. I was flying Sea King helicopters. If you're not aware what a Sea King is, it looks like Marine One, the president's helicopter that lands in the White House lawn. Although the one I was flying wasn't anywhere near as nice. Mine was a dull gray and much older and ricketier. Anyway, when I stopped doing that, I ended up going to a company in Ottawa called Newbridge. Someone I knew from my time in the military was a director there, and he was looking for contract work as a software tester. In the interview, he said, I need you to know 3 things. I need you to know Unix. And I said, I don't know Unix. And he said, that's okay, you can learn it. I need you to know telecommunications and how that works. And I said, I don't know telecommunications. And he says, that's okay, you can learn it. And I need you to be able to learn. Ha, I thought. And he said, and I know you can do that because you were a pilot. And I later found out that he had actually applied to be a pilot in the Canadian military and not made it through the selection process. So my being selected as a pilot allowed him to forego the whole plus I knew him, but he knew that I could think and I could learn things. So I ended up starting a 3-month contract job as a software tester. At the end of the contract, I got flipped to full-time, and that was in 1995. So I've been doing this for 22 years.
Excellent. So, head facilitator for CAST. For those who have not been to CAST before, what does that mean?
So I've been to lots of conferences, and CAST is the only one I've seen where there is a facilitator involved. I mean, I was a person who kind of managed a track room, but I didn't necessarily have interaction with the attendees of the sessions. So what is it about facilitation that's different?
CAST was the first conference, to my knowledge, to have a mandatory dedicated time of question and answers at the end of every single talk. Many conferences that I'd been to before CAST, the revered speaker would stand up, say stuff that you might agree with, you might think is insightful, or you might disagree with or have questions about. And they would take up almost all the time, if not all the time, and essentially say, I'd love to answer your questions, but I'm out of time, and then they would disappear. So a lot of times there was things that could have been a lot more informative for you, or you could have helped potentially point out flaws in what everybody had just written down, thinking the referred speaker just said that, I'm going to go implement it. And you might say, well, hey, I tried that and this happened. What would you have suggested to essentially help get the speaker's message across better for you to be able to implement or question what the speaker was saying? So at CAST, 1/3 of the time is dedicated for questions. So if it's an hour slot, then 40 minutes is the presentation and 20 minutes is for question and answer. We also have a commitment that if there is still questions to be asked of the speaker and that time runs out, that the speaker is available for questions after their session. We like to say we put the confer back in the conference. We have a dedicated period of time, and we have it facilitated so that extroverts and loud people like me don't dominate the conversation and everybody has a chance to be able to talk.
So one of the things that I've always kind of looked forward to, it was a unique experience for me the first time I went to CAST and I got my packet and I got the 3 cards. And so for somebody who will come in and say, okay, what are these 3 cards with the same number on it? What do they represent? And I know there's a story behind this, so.
There is. The conference facilitation style evolved out of peer conferences. The granddaddy of the testing peer conferences is called LAWST, the Los Altos Workshop on Software Testing. Back in the mid-90s, a bunch of big names in software testing like James Bach and Kem Kainer and Elizabeth Hendrickson and Doug Hoffman, and I'm sure I've forgotten a few important people who were at that meeting, got together to talk about why they couldn't get capture replay working. So they'd all been sold this concept of you can solve your testing woes by the tool vendors by using their tools, which would allow you to capture your test and then replay it later so that you would save time and money and all the other wonderful claims that the tool vendors were making. All of these very smart people that hopefully you've heard at least some of their names if you're listening to this, I believe there was 15 or so of them that got together. And at the end of the 3-day conference, they determined that none of them could make capture replay do anything near what the tool vendors were saying. And they all realized that this particular style of conference where individuals get together and share experiences, none of those people were there to present a theory or anything like that. They just got together and presented their experiences. And then they would question each other. So if I stood up and I was given half an hour, I took half an hour to tell my story about how I couldn't get capture replay to work, and then everyone would ask me questions. As those conferences progressed, it became evident that there was some people in the room who had louder voices than other people. So they developed a thread list and a couple of rules. One is during the telling of the story, you're only allowed to ask clarifying questions. So that is one of the rules we've adopted for conferences as well. You don't interrupt the speaker to ask a question that would derail their talk. But if they use an acronym that you don't understand, or there was something that you didn't hear because someone beside you coughed or something, you can raise your hand and ask a clarifying question, something that lets you understand the story. Once the presentation is done, then the facilitation in earnest begins. I won't give all the background into it, but it developed into something called open season at the end. And so all your tricky, difficult questions are in the open season part. And then the 3 cards, I was facilitating WOPR 3, the Workshop on Performance and Reliability Testing. That was the first workshop I facilitated, and the reason I had to facilitate it is Kem Kainer was stuck in Florida because Hurricane Ivan was almost directly over his house when his flight was supposed to leave, so he couldn't leave, and we were without a facilitator, so I volunteered to facilitate. At WOPR 4, after getting my feet wet at WOPR 3, I developed hand signals. So you can point at your palm if you want to be on the same thread. If I have a question based on the questions that are currently going on, so if someone's talking about, user interface testing and how you would test a text field, and I say, I have a question on testing text fields too, I would point at my palm, or what we do now, hold up a yellow card, meaning I have a question on this thread. And if I think, I have a question about database testing, then that would be a new thread. And my hand signals, I had a different hand signal for that. But now we would just hold up the green card, green being new. The feedback we got on the hand signals in an anonymous survey we did was that they were too confusing. And so I was complaining to my wife that I had come up with these great hand signals to make my job easier as facilitator, and that people found them too confusing. And so my wife, whose name is Karen, said, well, why don't you just hold up colored cards? Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. To which it was honestly revolutionary. Her casual comment, her haphazard, well, why don't you just do this comment, has literally changed how facilitation works at all peer conferences and at CAST and a couple of other conferences that have adopted the K card since CAST, like Let's Test in Sweden, which is now defunct, but Let's Test in South Africa also uses K cards. And they got their name K cards. My wife said she didn't want any credit for them at all. She thought it was an obvious thing and kind of like taking credit for breathing or something in her mind. Scott Barber, who was one of the main facilitators of peer conferences at the time, started to use them, and he wanted to give her credit, but he knew she didn't really want credit, so he was the one who gave them the name K cards after Karen. And so somebody, my wife, who didn't want any credit at all, has ended up having these cards named after her that have been used at well over 100 peer conferences and probably about 15 or 20 major conferences in the last 10 or 12 years.
I'll say that I am surprised having someone say, why don't you just blah, blah, blah? It doesn't usually turn out so well.
That's true. It is probably the single most revolutionary change to facilitation that we've had. I've facilitated over 50 conferences, peer conferences and major conferences, probably in the range of 48 or so peer conferences and 10 or so major conferences. All of those have used the K cards. They work very, very well. So what the three cards are, I've already alluded to it, but there's three colored cards. You have a green card, which at the beginning of the open season part, everyone should be holding up a green card because there's no current thread. So you hold up a green card saying, I have a new question. The facilitator will then select somebody at random. It's not a first in, first out queue by any means. I would select somebody to ask a question, and then if somebody else has a follow-up question or an add-on that's on that same thread, they would hold up a yellow card. And at any time, if you think of an unrelated question, you could also hold up a green card. The third colored card is a red card. And what a red card is, although it's usually hot pink, but we call it the red card. And the red card essentially says, I have something very, very important to say. So it could be, I can't hear. Somebody might have said, like if it was me and I'm sitting in the audience and somebody might have said, I heard Paul Holland said this. I might hold up a red card and say, well, that's not quite what I said. I said this. So essentially it's, I have something that's very important to say that's more important at this instant than anybody else in the room. So I'm putting myself at the top of the speaker stack. Some people abuse that privilege, and if the opinion of the facilitator that the red card is being abused, in other words, if you use it more than once or twice in a session, you'll probably get the red card taken away from you, and then you won't have one for the rest of the conference. So when you get your red card, use it judiciously or don't use it at all, because the message that you're essentially sending the rest of the room is, I have something to say that's more important than what you have to say.
So it definitely sounds to me like you need an army of people to be able to facilitate a conference like CAST. It's more than just taking questions. There's an art to this. To be a skilled facilitator takes a little bit of practice and training. And I've seen the facilitation group, it's its own core of workers, and you oftentimes have a really good rapport at these conferences. So what does it take to become a facilitator at CAST?
That's a really good question. It used to be a lot easier when we didn't have as many people who were trained and experienced. You used to just say, hey, I'm volunteering to be a facilitator, and I would add you to the list, and then we would train you. But now we actually have quite a few people who are already trained. And also because I wasn't facilitating the last 2 years, I'll admit it, I took the easy road out, and I asked specific people who I knew were good facilitators for this particular conference. But to answer your question, for next year, if someone is interested in being a facilitator, they should be able to reach out to the conference chair if the facilitator hasn't been announced yet, and then they would put you in touch with the head facilitator, at which point the head facilitator If it was me again next year, I would likely take 1, perhaps 2 new people to be able to learn. If someone is really, really interested in learning, they can approach me early in the conference this year, and I will see if I can find a test session that they could facilitate, and I can go and monitor them and give them a bit of training up front. What we used to do, because clearly there weren't very many people who were trained, all of the volunteers, back when we used to take a lot of volunteers, everyone would get 1 or 2 sessions, so that way you wouldn't end up with somebody who ended up not being a good facilitator, because it is an art and it is a skill to it, and some people just are not good facilitators. And I wouldn't want them to have the responsibility of facilitating, say, 5 or 6 sessions if it turns out after 1 or 2 that they're not good, because that would be an awkward situation to say, I'm sorry, Bob, you're not going to facilitate the next 4 sessions that I had planned for you because you're a horrible facilitator. To avoid that, we try to do a trial facilitation. Sometimes if it's somebody brand new, I will be at the front and I will be there to stand in. Sometimes the crowd gets out of control, and it's quite interesting to watch, actually, because the rooms are fairly large and they have over 20 people in them, and the limit for most peer conferences is often set at 20, because once you get past 20 it gets exponentially harder to facilitate a room. So I know a lot of people who facilitated rooms with 18 without a problem, and then they tried to facilitate a room with 22 in it and the wheels fell off the bus and everyone was just talking over everybody else. There's only 2 of us I know who can facilitate over 25 people in a room. My maximum is 28, and I felt that I was on the verge of I can't really go any more than this, or I won't be able to keep control in the room. The other 2 are obviously Rich Robinson, who's been the head facilitator, and Eric Pregler, who's, I think, the vice president right now at the AST. Those are the 3 strongest facilitators, and then there's a bunch of others, including those who are at this conference. But what we end up needing to do for keynotes, because a keynote can have a couple of 100 people in the room, we tried this facilitation method at Eurostar, and it had 1,200 people there. The facilitation style still worked, but we had 5 or 6 microphone runners. It was a big amphitheater, and there was just a bunch of people running with microphones so that we could hear the questions. And so we can do a teamwork approach to the facilitation where one person controls whose talks, but with subtle hand signals was sending microphone runners all around the room as well.
And for those of you out there who are intrigued or who are wondering what this unique method of facilitation is all about, then it sounds to me like you should head on over to www.associationforsoftwaretesting.org, click on the CAST 2017 link, sign on up, and come out and see this for yourself. And as always, we look forward to seeing you, getting a chance to talk to you. And if you are interested in the idea of getting involved with facilitation, look us up, look Paul up, and we can give you further information at that point in time. Thank you for joining us today, Paul. And in addition to all of our listeners, thank you for listening to the CASTcast.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.